Dr. David Suzuki is a very familiar voice that many of us can remember from our childhood through his shows called The Nature of Things, Quirks and Quarks. His official CV runs 17 pages, so I'm going to cut to the highlights. It is true he has dozens of academic and broadcasting awards, as well as 25 honorary degrees. Yes, it's true that he's written or collaborated on 50 books, and yes, it is true he was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, equivalent to Nobel Prize. And yes, it is true he is a companion of the Order of Canada. In 2004, David was on a list of final nominees in the CBC television series that asked viewers to select the greatest Canadian of all time. Dr. Suzuki was the finalist, the 5th finalist. He is now the greatest living Canadian of that group of 5. In preparation of my introduction to Dr. Suzuki, I was asking myself, what is really the true nature of David Suzuki with all his quirks and quarks? And what really has made him great that really transcends all his accomplishments and his awards? An observation about people who consider great are ordinary citizens who become extraordinarily passionate and will stand up for what they truly believe in spite of the adverse consequences they face. These extraordinary people will encounter equally strong adversarial headwinds that usually stem from forces that feel threatened or fear of losing their power base and influence. Dr. Suzuki is no exception. He has faced many challenging and adversarial times. So what is the nature of David Suzuki? David, you are a man for all seasons, an enlightening rod. You are a formidable spirit who embodies the very ideal of passion and inspiration, one who is true to thyself. And Dr. Suzuki, it is truly our honor to have you here with us in Niagara and hear your story about what's important to you.
Merci. Merci, mes amis. C'est un grand honneur d'être ici ce soir. Merci beaucoup. I thought someone had to say something in French. This is Canada. And before I start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in the traditional territory of First Nations. I tried Googling and finding out which ones. And I see, there were Seneca, Iroquois. So I don't really know whether it's the Six Nations that are what you'd call it, but I recognize and thank the traditional people who cared for this land for thousands of years. What an inspirational story we've heard, both of them, Walter and Lucien. I cried as you did, listening to your story. And I can't remember the name of the young boy. Was it Matt? Yeah. I blubbered when you talked, Matt. But thank you. I wouldn't have missed this. You know that my wife and children are at a U2 concert in Vancouver. And I missed it to be here. And I don't regret that at all. It is such a thrill and honor to be here. Learning about Pathstone, I can't help but say are the people of this area very, very lucky to have such an organization, and congratulations for the new building that you have and that you'll celebrate in just a few weeks. What a great time to come here and celebrate with you tonight. In terms of mental health, I know the problems very, very clearly in my own family. My kid's sister has been in and out of institutions. And I have 2 Indigenous grandchildren who live on reserve with their mother and father. The mother's my daughter. And I can tell you the issues in First Nations communities are enormous. And all of the news stories you hear about residential schools and the consequences, they're true. And they reverberate as if they're inherited through the generations. My son-in-law is a wonderful man, but he's wounded. And it's going to take a long time to get over those wounds. And I feel desperately that I want to shield my grandsons from what my son-in-law has gone through. As a longtime environmentalist, I believe, and you may think me naive, that mental and physical health are intimately connected. I don't think you can have one without the other. And today, health costs, as you know, are the major expenditure of governments. And they continue to climb year after year as more and more people develop health issues that have to be treated, as new drugs and analytical techniques become available, and as the population ages. It's old-timers like me that are going to be a lot of your health costs in future. But we can't have a system where costs rise forever, as they seem to be now. Of course, when people get sick, they must be treated. But shouldn't we be focused on keeping people healthy in the first place, on prevention? And to do that, we have to know what causes the health problems, mental and physical, that we confront in the first place. And I believe that we are living in a world that is becoming increasingly unhealthy, physically, mentally, and spiritually, and it's an environment we have created. In 100 years, you see, humanity has undergone an amazing change in the way that we live. In 1900, when there were 1.5 billion people, can you imagine only 1.5 billion people in the world? There were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest with 6.5 million. Tokyo was the 7th largest city in the world with 1.5 million people. We didn't have any cities, of course, in Canada with more than 1 million people. The vast majority of people around the world, including in North America, lived in rural village communities because most people were involved in some aspect of agriculture. By 2000, in only 100 years, there were 6 billion people in the world and more than 400 cities with more than 1 million people. By 2000, Tokyo had become the largest city on the planet with over 30 million people. Can you imagine? They had the entire equivalent of Canada's population in one city. And if you've ever visited Tokyo, you know humans should not live that way. This, around the world, by 2000, over half of all people on the planet lived in big cities, 85% of us in Canada. So we have been transformed in a century from farmers into urban dwellers. But cities were never designed for the human scale, to be on a human scale. When I was a child in London, Ontario, after the war, we lived in a house with less than 1,000 square feet. 3 sisters, me, and my 2 parents. Only 1 bathroom. I was often knocking on the door because my sisters, but I never peed my pants waiting for them. But today, a modern house, these McMansions, have 1 bathroom per person. I guess today, you gotta go immediately, no waiting. When I was a child and such growing up in London, the constant refrain from my parents was, David, go outside and play. And if I said, but Mummy, it's raining. I don't care, you got a raincoat. Go call Bobby and go outside. That was the refrain. And we went outside because people were sitting on porches. They were watching us. The neighborhood was a real neighborhood in a community. They took care of us. And I can tell you, when it's raining, a puddle is an absolutely magical place. Absolutely. And I live it every time my grandchildren come down from Haida Gwaii to stay with us in Vancouver. They love puddles, and the things that they do are amazing. Children today, though, I mean, those were wonderful days growing up as a child in London. But children today live primarily inside. It's unsafe out there. Speeding cars. There may be a pervert lurking behind a bush. I don't know what it is. But today in the cities in Canada, the average child spends less than 8 minutes a day outside and more than 6 hours a day in front of a screen. The human body, and the cities were designed, of course, not for human beings. They were designed for vehicles, for the efficiency of transport. And of course, what those vehicles have done is not only pollute the air that we depend on, but they've made us use them so much that we're not doing what the body was built for, and that is to move. The body was built to be exercised. The human body evolved outside. For 95% of our existence, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We had to carry everything we owned on our backs, and we had to follow animals and plants through the seasons. And believe me, you have a very different relationship when you have to live outside that way. Today, we want to reduce health risks, and I can absolutely guarantee you the most effective way is to get people out and exercise. This is by far the best way, exceeding, if a drug could do what exercise does, I would be a trillionaire. I mean, exercise means you reduce the risk of cancer, of stroke, of heart disease, of Alzheimer's, of diabetes, of obesity. These are all reduced by over 30% if we begin using our bodies in the way that they were meant to be used. There is no drug that could come close to having that kind of result. Every fossil fuel-powered machine emits pollutants. One of the main ones, of course, is carbon dioxide, which has become a problem, but plus all of the breakdown products of gasoline. Our factories use the air or water or soil to dump their toxic effluents. When I was a child and my mother sent me to the store to buy vegetables or fruit in the winter, I went to the canned goods section. That's the way it was. Today, we expect, even in Canada, for heaven's sakes, in the middle of winter, to go down and buy fresh fruits and vegetables. How do you think those things got here? They weren't grown in Canada, and an enormous amount of energy was used and pollutants produced just to get that food to us 12 months a year. The vast array of food, fresh vegetables and fruits in Canada in the middle of winter, fresh apples from New Zealand, bananas from South America, coffee from Africa, all are delivered in a way that creates other kinds of problems. And to grow food on an industrial scale, chemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, preservatives, hormones are sprayed onto or injected into the food that we are going to eat. 40 years ago, I invited my wife's parents, when they retired, to come and live with us. I never imagined they would live as long as they did. My father-in-law died 3 years ago at the age of 95. My mother-in-law died last year at 97. But what shocked me when I invited them to live with us was the disapproval of the people around. People thought that was weird to invite parents, especially in-laws, to come in. Even their son, my brother-in-law, said, I love my parents, but they drive me nuts. You're nuts to do this. Well, they didn't live in our space. I took the roof off our house and built another apartment for them. But our children grew up having both of their grandparents right up above them. And you know, when you're living with someone 24 hours a day, parents or children get pissed off at each other at times, and my children could run upstairs and find instant love from grandma and granddad. It was absolutely wonderful. Few children today in Canada have grandparents living in the same neighborhood, let alone in the same city, let alone being able to see them every single day. It was a wonderful arrangement. And when And the children have only known the kind of a situation that we had. But they were our built-in babysitters, our gardener, our house fixer-uppers. They played a very important role in my life and in the life of my children. And I must admit, I'm not proud of much of what I've done, but I am proud that I invited them in and promised to take care of them. And I did until they both died. They each died at home with family around them. But there is no way to measure, there's no way to measure the value of that way of living. But I know that our mental and spiritual health, especially my wife's, was enormously benefited by having Grandma and Granddad upstairs. In cities, we have become isolated from nature. I have a friend who lives in the northern side of Toronto, who lives in an air-conditioned apartment. He told me he goes downstairs in the elevator, into the basement, into his air-conditioned car, drives down the Don Valley Freeway into the basement of his air-conditioned commercial building, which is connected through tunnels to all kinds of shopping areas. And he said to me, you know, David, I don't have to go outside for weeks. That's the kind of world that we have created. In Japan, there is an ancient Shinto practice which translated from Japanese means forest bathing. And families on weekends go out into the forest and bathe the air that comes from the trees. And now it's becoming very, very clear that we literally are bathing in a soup of chemicals that those trees are producing. They're not doing it to benefit us, but many of the molecules that they give off, in fact, we inhale, and they affect our brains. They affect the kinds of hormones that are released by various parts of the brain. They, in fact, affect us in ways that we are only now beginning to understand. In battles over British Columbia forests, which I began to be engaged in back in the 1960s, they used to snarl at us and call us tree huggers. Well, today I embrace that term with great pride. Yes, I hug trees because it's good for me and it's good for all of us. The eminent Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson has pointed out that we evolved in a state of nature and that we have an inbuilt need, a genetic need, to what he calls affiliate with other species. We have to be in the presence of other species. And he calls that need biophilia, bio-life, philia, love. We have a built-in love of life. Even in cities, the expression of our needs for other species is reflected in the way that we garden, is reflected in the food that we eat, the flowers and grow, the flowers we have, and the pets that we keep around us. There are books of scientific evidence now that biophilia is real and can be measured and demonstrated. Many hospitals now allow animals into the intensive care units because it helps patients in great distress. Animals help people in old age homes, in groups of people with cancer. Seeing trees outside of a hospital window helps us physically and mentally. The David Suzuki Foundation did a study in Toronto that showed that trees on city streets have a direct correlation then with the amount of money you save in hospital bills for each block. The more trees you have, the lower your hospital bills. But we tend to counter biophilia. I've seen it as parents tell children who bring a bottle with something in, don't touch that, might bite. Ooh, disgusting. We teach children what is the counter of our biophilic impulse, that nature is dirty, disgusting, or dangerous. So I suggest we are creating living places that are unhealthy. We deprive children of exposure to nature. We deprive people of the opportunity to move and exercise, and we are poisoning the air, the water, and the soil. Human beings have undergone in addition to the move to cities, an incredible shift in the way that we live on this planet over the last 150 years. In only a century or two, we have exploded into a new kind of biological creature. We are now the most numerous mammal on the planet. There are more of us than any species of mouse, rabbit, or rat. We are now the dominant mammal. And just the fact of our living, we need to eat, we need to have shelter and clothing. Just the act of living, since there are more than 7 billion of us, means that we have a huge ecological footprint. It takes a lot of air, water, and land to support our population of 7 billion. And so there's never been a creature with as much of an environmental impact as we have. But of course, because we're not like rabbits or rats or mice, we've got an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. And you just have to look at the tables with the tablecloths and the glasses and the food that we ate and all of the paraphernalia that comes with a gala like this. All of that has come out of the earth. And when we're finished with it, it'll go back into the earth. And all of the technology we use to exploit every aspect of the planet's surface, to look for raw materials, to feed into our industrial system, to produce things for people. And that technological muscle power has amplified our ecological footprint. And then ever since the end of World War II, we've been afflicted with a tremendous appetite for consumption of stuff. We love to shop. 94% of American teenage girls a few years ago in a poll ranked shopping as their #1 recreation. So we love to buy stuff. My parents married during the Great Depression. And because of the Great Depression, they learned hard lessons that they taught us. Save some for tomorrow. Live within your means. Share, don't be greedy. You have to work hard to make money to buy the necessities in life. But you don't run after money as if having more money or things makes you a better, more important person. How quaint those ideas. Yeah, I know, but they just don't seem to apply today in this world. That's what I grew up with. But children today grow up in a very different world. 70% of the Canadian economy is based on consumption. And it sure as hell isn't the necessities in life. Just go into a Walmart's and ask how much of all of this stuff. Whenever I go into a store like Walmart's, I go, I didn't even know I wanted it, but now I want it. How much of that stuff really serves our needs and how much serves our wants? And I think most of it is about what we want. And so consumption then has increased enormously our ecological footprint. And of course, that's all being driven, our consumption is being driven by a global economy that exploits the entire planet for raw materials, dumps our toxic effluents into the global commons, and sells stuff to the world population. That's why scientists now call this the Anthropocene Epoch, the time in geological history when human beings have become the major factor altering the chemical, physical, and biological features of the planet. This is the age of humans, and we are having a huge impact on the planet, but because we don't know enough, we are applying our enormous demands, our consumption, and our technology without any idea how to do it in a way that is sustainable. Once, not long ago, we called hurricanes, we called floods and mega fires, droughts and earthquakes, natural disasters. There's nothing natural about them anymore. Look at what's happening in Quebec now, or in Kelowna, British Columbia. As the air warms up, it can hold more moisture. The oceans are evaporating, and air is being transported across land, then carrying a hell of a lot more water. And when it rains, it dumps. And you get floods in places like Calgary and Toronto, which is where we never had floods before. The human imprint is everywhere, including on earthquakes. We're fracking. one of the dumbest ways to get energy you can imagine. We're fracking because of the enormous amounts of water being pumped into the ground are causing earthquakes. You just have to look at Oklahoma to see where they used to have maybe 3 or 4 earthquakes a year. They're now having 3 or 4 or 6 earthquakes a day in Oklahoma. We also call these events acts of God, but we have seemed to have taken the place of the gods. We're up there, and we are the major factor causing all of these changes. How on earth did we get to this position? I'm a geneticist, and I've been intrigued by the way biologists today can use DNA, the genetic material, and track the movement of human beings across the planet. And all of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. That was our birthplace. And I can't wait to talk to the Ku Klux Klan and tell them, what the hell's your problem? We're all Africans, for heaven's sakes. Africa was our birthplace in the Great Plains of that continent. And try to imagine if we could be transported back to the Great Plains of Africa 150,000 years ago. They would have been covered with animals in size, in abundance, in diversity, beyond anything that we would see in the Serengeti today. And we'd have to look really hard to spot those clumps of 3, 4, or 5, those funny-looking, upright, the 2-legged, furless apes. And that was us. And I'm sure no other animal 150,000 years ago said to their kids, shh, don't get him pissed off at you. They're going to take over the planet. I mean, what did we have going for us? We weren't very big. There weren't many of us. We weren't fast. We weren't strong. We didn't have special sensory ability. How could this nondescript creature, this naked ape, take over the planet as we have? Well, of course, the answer is we had a secret that was hidden. And it was that 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. And that more than compensated for our lack of physical and sensory ability. And so the Nobel Prize winner Francois Jacob said, the human brain has an innate need for order. We don't like looking out in the world and not understanding what the heck is going on. So coming into a habitat, we want to know how does all of it work? And with our experience and knowledge, we put it together in what's called a worldview. Now, there's a lot of guesses and superstitions and stuff, but we try to make sense of the world around us. And in a worldview, nothing exists in isolation. Everything is connected. If a woman gives birth to a 2-headed child, people didn't go, oh, that's just a freak accident. They go, wow, are we being punished for something we did wrong? Or is it a sign of something incredible happening in the future? Everything was interlinked in a worldview. And that allowed us then to live in those great areas of Africa. But we began to move. We don't know why humans began to move out of what was our home. Probably population was growing too much. We were depleting some resources. And I like to think that teenage kids are going, hey, maybe we can get some action on the other side of the mountain. Because, you know, humans bred with Neanderthals, so maybe there were some good-looking Neanderthal chicks over there. I don't know. But for whatever reason, we moved. And we would come into new areas. And wow, there are birds without wings. They're easy to catch and they're yummy to eat. Or there were those slow-moving giant sloths, and with an axe or a stone club, we could easily catch them and kill them. And we began to exploit the animals and plants in the new area. But we were an invasive species. We didn't know how it all worked. But we were clever, and even with simple tools like stone axes and spears and digging sticks, we were very, very effective. And you can follow the movement of humans by the record of animals that went extinct as we began to move. So even with simple tools, we were a pretty deadly predator. But again, as we inhabited new areas, we had to put things together, and no doubt we overexploited things. And we had to say, hey, we've got to live differently. We don't have any of those big big mammals anymore. They've disappeared. So we better start living here in a different way. Or let's go look on the next mountain and see what we can find over there. So that's been the history of our species, moving into new habitats and then moving again until we occupied the entire planet. But the people left behind remembered. They told the stories about what their ancestors had done, where they had succeeded, where they had failed, where they had made mistakes. That is the essence of indigenous knowledge around the planet. And that is the essence of sustainable living. It is the only history of groups on this planet that have been shown to be sustainable over thousands of years. And so indigenous people, I believe, in today's world of ecological crisis, it is indigenous knowledge that we are going to need to help guide us into this very, very different planet that we are now inhabiting. For decades now, the leading scientists of the world have been telling us we're heading down a very dangerous path. I'm not going to recite all of the terrible things that are happening. We've got more carbon dioxide in the air now than we have in records going back several million years, and it's happened very, very suddenly. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, where it interacts with the oceans, dissolves into the water as carbonic acid, so the pH is dropping. We're acidifying the oceans with enormous ecological consequences. We need to take more and more carbon out of the atmosphere because we're burning so much fossil fuel, but at that very time we're cutting down our forests, which are the best carbon sink that we have available. And as I said, we've used air, water, and soil as a toxic dump, so that, I'm sorry, but every one of you in this room, if you want to be tested, I guarantee every one of you is carrying dozens of toxic chemicals in your bodies. How can you not when we're using the earth as a garbage can? One of the problems we face today is that most of us live in cities. And in a city, our highest priority becomes our jobs. We need a job to earn the money to buy the things that we want. And so the economy becomes the primary focus of our activities. So when Mr. Harper, our Prime Minister for 9.5 horrifying years, when Mr. Harper said, we can't do anything about climate change, it'll destroy the economy, he elevated the economy above the very atmosphere that gives us weather and climate and keeps us alive. And this is the crisis, I believe, that we face, is that we've elevated our human constructs as if they're more important than the really important things that keep us alive. Can I go on for 5 more minutes? So I just want to end by giving you a couple of stories in my experience that may illustrate what the problem is. As you know, we've been battling over the tar sands in Alberta now for many, many years. And if our commitment at Paris in 2015, if we mean the commitment we made in Paris, it means that 80% of the oil and gas and coal that we know where it is, has to be left where it is. Trudeau kind of tiptoed into that by saying, well, we can't take all of the tar sands, and got hammered so heavily, he backtracked immediately and said, no country would leave that much oil in the ground. We have to leave it in the ground if we are going to meet the targets that were set in in Paris in 2015. So 4 years ago, I got a call from the CEO of one of the largest companies in the tar sands of Alberta. David, could I come and talk to you? I said, wow, of course, I would be honored. That's great. I'm not into fighting. Come down. He came down to my office the next morning, all the way from Fort McMurray. So he came to the door and I said, thank you so much for coming. I'm honored. I'm thrilled. And I did all that stuff, you know. And then I said, but before you come in my office, I want you to do me one favor. I said, I want you to leave your identity as a CEO of an oil company outside the door, because I want to meet you human being to human being. I don't see the point in negotiating until you and I start from a point of agreement. Surely we have to have a foundation of what we all as human beings agree are our most important needs, and then we can begin to build our economy and our politics and our society and so on. Well, to his credit, he came in, but he was not very happy because, of course, he had come down to negotiate as the CEO of an oil company. So I took him into my office. I said, look, I understand this is awkward for you, but let me tell you what I mean. I said, we live in a world that is shaped by laws of nature, and there's nothing we can do about those laws. We have to live within them because they determine what the world is like. Those laws determine the limits and the opportunities that exist in the world. So he looked puzzled. I said, look, physics tells us you can't build a rocket that will move faster than the speed of light. Okay? That's the limit. Nobody talks about, except science fiction writers, nobody talks about we need a rocket that will go 100 times faster than the speed of light. We understand the speed of light is it. The law of gravity says if I trip on those stairs, I'm going to fall on my head. That's gravity, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us you cannot build a perpetual motion machine. Any guy that tries to sell you a perpetual motion machine, put him in jail because it's not true. We live within the confines, the strictures of the laws of physics, and nobody argues with that. They shape the world, and we live within that. Chemistry, it's the same. The atomic properties of all of the elements determine the melting point, the freezing point, determine the weight of atoms, dictate the diffusion constants and reaction rates, and they tell you what kinds of atoms you can put in a test tube to synthesize what kinds of molecules, and chemistry tells us what we can or cannot do, and we live with that. That's the world that we live in. And in biology, it's the same. Every species of plant or animal has a maximum number that can be maintained indefinitely. Exceed that number and your population will crash. That number is dictated by what's called the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. And humans, of course, we say, oh, but we're intelligent. We're not confined to an ecosystem or habitat. That's true. But our home is still the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. That's our home. And it's fixed. It can't grow. And remember, Carl Sagan used to tell us that if you reduced Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere in which all life exists would be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. That's it. That's our home. It can't grow. And that then dictates how many humans could be carried. And humans, of course, the number of humans or the impact is determined by two things: how many there are and how much we consume per person. You have to factor in per capita consumption. And when you multiply the consumption with our population, we think of Canada as a big country with a small population. Forget it. We are way overpopulated. You want to compare Canada with China? Multiply by 20 to 40. That's how much more we use of everything on the planet. And it's the same with the United States. If you want to compare us to Somalia or Bangladesh, multiply by 60 to 80, and you'll get an idea of our impact on the planet. And by that criterion, we're way overpopulated. And the Earth as a whole, the biosphere, is overpopulated with humans. And the only thing that we can do is reduce our consumption if we want to have an immediate impact. Now, when I say this, we're way over the carrying capacity of the biosphere. People get really ticked off at me. Look at our stores, they're filled with stuff. Look at our people, we're healthier and living longer. And I say, it may be true that things look great, but we have created the illusion that everything is fine and can keep going on like this, by using up what is the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. Ask any elder who's lived in this area for 60 or 70 years, what was it like when you were a kid? I've done this in Africa. I've done this in South America. And everywhere you go, elders tell you the same thing. Oh, it used to be so different. The rivers used to be jammed with fish. The skies used to be filled with birds. All over the world, our elders are a living record of the enormous changes that have gone on in the span of a single human life. and that is simply not sustainable. So I said to the CEO, those are factors that shape the way that we live, okay? And then I said, biology also tells us we are animals. I gave a speech in Austin, Texas, back in the 1990s. Big audience, there were about 3,000 people, and a lot of kids in the audience. I said, now kids, if you remember one thing from my talk, remember, we are animals. Man, did their parents get pissed off at me. This woman came up, don't you call my daughter an animal, we're human beings. I said, madam, if your daughter isn't an animal, is she a plant? Because we're either one or the other. We are animals. And I said, Mr. CEO, as an animal, what is the absolutely most important need every human being has? And instead of giving me the answer immediately as any child would, he goes, and I could see he's thinking, a job, money. I said, if you don't have air for 3 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So can you not agree with me? Clean air has got to be the highest priority. Indeed, we should consider clean air sacred. We shouldn't mess with that. It gives us and all life on earth life, for heaven's sakes. And then I said, you and I, we're 60 to 70% water. We're just a big blob of water with enough thickener added so we don't dribble away on the floor. We're water. But water, you know, it leaks out of our skin and our eyes and our mouth and our crotch, and we lose water all the time, so we have to top up. I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. If you have to drink contaminated water, you're sick. So would you not agree with me that clean water, like clean air, is sacred? That is one of our highest priority. And then I said, you can go a lot longer with food, and I see some people here who go a lot longer than me, but 4 to 6 weeks without food, you die. Contaminated food, you get sick. And most of our food was grown in the soil, and every bit of our food was once alive. So, Mr. CEO, would you agree that clean food and soil must be there with clean water and clean air? And finally, I said, all of the energy in our bodies that we need to move and work and grow and reproduce, all of that energy is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants, converted then into sugars, which store that energy, and then we get the sugars by eating the animals or that eat the plants or eating the plants, and we store those sugars in our bodies as fats and other things. And then when we need to work, we burn those molecules and liberate the energy of the sun back out in our bodies. So photosynthesis, like water and air and soil, must be considered a basic need. So I said, Mr. CEO, every society, every corporation, every human being should regard clean air, clean water, clean soil and food, and clean energy through photosynthesis as sacred, as the very foundation of the way we live. Because without them, we either die or we sicken. And then I said, the final thing is the miracle of life on earth, is that those 4 things that indigenous people call the 4 sacred elements, earth, air, fire, and water, those sacred elements are cleansed, replenished, renewed by life itself. Life creates the sacred elements. Before there were any plants on earth, there was no oxygen in the air. Oxygen is a very reactive element. When oxygen is present, it immediately oxidizes things. It rusts metals. Oxygen is very reactive and disappears. Before there were plants, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. But over hundreds of millions of years, plants created the oxygen-rich atmosphere that animals like us depend on. To this very day, it's all of the plants and animals in the world who are creating this atmosphere for us to depend on. And it's all of the plants, of course, that give us our energy through photosynthesis. And life is a part of the hydrologic cycle. The water evaporates, rains on land, percolates into the soil, runs into rivers and lakes. Life is filtering water. In Vancouver, we get our water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. When it rains, the big tree roots, the soil plant roots, and the fungi and bacteria filter the water. We don't have to do anything to it. We can just drink it. And that's the way it was for most of human existence on the planet. Life filters the water so that it's potable. And finally, life is our food. Every bit of our bodies are made up from the carcasses of plants and animals. And soil, on which we grow most of our food, of course, was created by life. You all know the movie The Martian. And remember, Matt Damon is stranded on Mars. He's got to wait 4 years for rescue, but he's only got 1 year worth of potatoes. How can he grow potatoes when there's no soil on Mars? Soil is created by the carcasses of plants and animals, mixing with soil, with the sand and dust and clay and gravel over long periods of time. That creates soil. So and soil is created by life. So I said to the CEO, would you not agree with me? Those earth, air, fire, and water, and biodiversity, which we call biodiversity, which indigenous people call our relatives, the plants and animals, that those should be the foundation of the way we live. They should be sacred, and we should protect them. And then I said, other things, we draw lines around our property, around our cities, our provinces, our countries. And boy, do we take those boundaries seriously. We're allowed to kill and die trying to protect those lines. But you know what? Nature doesn't give a hoot about our human-created boundaries. And I'm always struck by that. We get salmon that are born in rivers in British Columbia. They then go through the Alaskan Panhandle. They swim up the ocean along Alaska, Russia, Japan, and then they come back. And each country says, oh, there are salmon. Those salmon know very well who they belong to. They pay absolutely no attention to our borders. And in Ontario, you know that very, very well. Do you think monarch butterflies care whether they're in Ontario or the United States or Mexico? They know where their habitat is, and it sure doesn't involve human boundaries. And we create other things. Capitalism, the economy, markets, corporations. These are not forces of nature. They're human constructs. And yet we're constantly trying to shoehorn these constructs and shoehorn nature to fit into our corporate or economic demands. This is crazy. The only things we can change are the things that we create. And yet we're constantly making, logging industry's in trouble, so we'll let you log more above the annual allowable cut because we need that income. Or, I know this chemical plant is in trouble, so you can pour more pollutants out into the river. We won't pay attention. We're always asking nature to pay the price for our economic or corporate demands. This doesn't make any sense. Those are human constructs, and we can change them. So I said to this CEO, if you could shake hands with me and agree with me that those are the basic elements on which humans live and must be protected, earth, air, fire, and water, and our relatives, the plants and animals that share the earth with us, and that the human constructs must be shaped to conform to the laws of nature. I said, if you would shake hands with me, sir, I will do everything I can to help you and your company. Now, what do you think he did? He was a good man. I liked him. But he couldn't possibly shake hands. He couldn't go back to his shareholders and say, listen, I talked to Suzuki and he's right. Whatever we do, we can't mess with the air, the water, and the soil. He'd get fired in a flash because corporations don't pay any attention to those things. Corporations exist. They may do all kinds of wonderful things for us, but they exist for one reason and one reason only, and that is to make money. The more, the faster, the better. But none of the needs of nature, none of the laws of nature impinge or restrict those corporations if they can find a way to somehow violate them. And this is the problem that we face. We have created structures that have become so important to us. We think that we have to make nature bow to our needs, as Mr. Harper did when he said, we can't do anything about global warming. It'll destroy the economy. That's crazy. Let me end with one story. Holy, I've gone way too long. It's a shorter story. In the 1990s, Hong Kong was about to revert to China. You may remember that. And there was a lot of wealth in China, in Hong Kong, that was very nervous. They didn't know how this was all going to come about and what would happen to that city. And so they were sending their money out of Hong Kong to invest. And I live in a wonderful part of Vancouver. I've lived in the same house for 45 years because I believe staying put is the important thing in environmentalism. And that house is my home. I got a letter in the 1990s from a real estate agent that said, offshore money is pouring into Vancouver. Now is a good time to sell your house and buy up. I'd never heard the concept of buying up. I came to understand you buy a starter home and then, you know, you get enough money or the value goes up, you sell it and you get a bigger home. And that's what this is all about. Well, those are houses, properties. But for me, that house was my home. And I was really upset when I got this letter. So I said, okay, if I was to put my property on the market, what are the things that I would put down as the things that make it my home and of greatest value? And the first thing I wrote down was the fact that my in-laws had lived there for 30 years by that point. And so my children had their grandparents all upstairs all their lives. And I put that down as the highest value of my home. My father-in-law was the gardener, and he knew I loved asparagus and raspberries, and he planted them for me in the garden. And I had been in the States for a month, and I came back, I was exhausted, and came home, and my father-in-law met me at the door with a bag. He said, this is the first crop of asparagus that came off, and it's yours. These are yours, and I saved it for you. And I put that down. When Tara and I were first married, we had an apartment, and my father was a cabinet maker, and he built a kitchen cabinet for us. When we bought this house, I tore it out and put it in the house. Looks like hell, and it doesn't belong there. But every time I open the cabinet door, I think of my father, and I put that down. My children, when our dog died, we buried her under the dogwood tree. And then they began to gather roadkill, snakes and birds. And so we now have an animal cemetery under the dogwood, and I put that down. And one year, my best friend from Toronto came out to stay with me for a week, and I was building a fence along the water. And he spent a long time carving a handle for the gate. We've torn that gate and fence down now, but I've saved the handle. Because every time I opened that gate, I thought of my best friend. And as I began to put that list of the things that made that property my home, I realized those are the things that are priceless beyond evaluation. They make this place precious to me, and they have absolutely no value in the market. And I think of Indigenous people who have lived in their place for thousands of years, where every rock, where every creek, where every forest is sacred and has meaning to them. And you see then that so long as we run on this economic paradigm as if the economy and money determines the value of everything that matters to us, then we are not going to confront the real ecological crisis we face. Thank you.
Dr. Suzuki, on behalf of the thousands of children that Pathstone helps every year, I'd like to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. And for the past 55 years, I thought I was Serbian. Tonight, I found out I'm from Africa. And It is so coincidental that our token of our appreciation just happens to be a basket that was woven by hand in West Africa.
Wow.
And it's full of some of the best Niagara wines, which happen to come from my favorite, certified sustainable Niagara-on-the-Lake winery. So thank you.
Thank you.